So tonight's speaker began her career in human and civil rights activism while attending Howard University in the summer of 1965. She's a trained facilitator and has been a leader in nonviolent civil disobedience since the 1970s anti-Vietnam War movement. In the 80s, she was a supporter of human rights for indigenous populations, particularly in South America. In 2006, Carol purchased and restored the birthplace of Susan B. Anthony in Adams, Massachusetts. 4 years later, it opened as a historic home museum, honoring our feminist foremother. To recognize this accomplishment, Carol received the Northern Berkshire, Massachusetts Business and Professional Women Award. Tonight, she will share stories from her book entitled Vintage Tweets, Suffrage Era Postcards. Please welcome Carol Crossid.
Okay, all right. Thank you so much. Thank you, Hilda. Thank you so much. I'm so delighted to be here. I've done this a number of times in Massachusetts. Just a couple of weeks ago, I did it at Chatham, and I was able to do that in person, and a number of these have been in person, but Zoom, I'm not a techie person, so I'm going to introduce to you. This is Carrie Miller, and she is helping with this program tonight. So thank you so much. She's doing our techie. So this is the book. It's one of those kind of coffee tabletop books. It's a large size. And the postcards that I'm going to present to you tonight are displayed in their full size in this book. So there's 2 or 3 to a page, so you can imagine, what the size of the book is. The print and paper industries, really expanded in the mid 19th century, which, because of the Transcontinental Railroad, it really reached its height, and we were able to create things like postcards and mail these postcards across the country. So this really is a sampling of the propaganda that the suffrage movement used in order to promote and advocate for their issue of women's right to vote in their enfranchisement. So interestingly enough, everybody has a very strange hobby. My hobby is to collect very old postcards. I've done this. My husband converts old buildings in the city, and so I collect postcards of the buildings before they were converted, and do all sorts of strange things with postcards. One of the important things to know is that because all of these postcards are over 100 years of age, it was not required to research the artist or the producer of the postcards because they're in the public domain, because they're over 100 years of age. And of course, the suffrage centennial was in 2020, and the book was produced in 2020. Or in 2019, and so all the cards are obviously over 100 years of age. So it made the job a little bit easier. But as you'll see as we go through, some of these postcards have really significant artists, and so I will point those out to you. I have about 650 postcards, but I'm not going to show you all of those tonight. I'm going to show you a sampling of the 400 that are displayed in Vintage Tweets. So Susan B. Anthony, of course, was born in 1820. So she was exactly 100 years of age when the Susan B. Anthony Amendment was passed, which is the 19th Amendment to the US Constitution, which gave women the right to vote. And it was called the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. Another very historic, so we celebrated Susan B. Anthony's 100th birthday, and we celebrated the 100th anniversary of the right to vote in the same year. So it was a very, very significant year. So the first three pictures that you're going to see are actually not postcards. These are just shamelessly just showing you a few pictures of the museum in Adams, Massachusetts, about 2 hours from where you are, maybe a little more, I'm not sure. So this is just the inside of the current museum. These are two of the 5 rooms in the museum. It's a small museum. It's a house museum, only the first floor, about 1,000 square feet. The centerpiece of the museum is the room where Susan B. Anthony was born, of course, which is on the left there. On the right is pictured Daniel Anthony's store, where Susan's father, Daniel, sold the cloth that he milled in the Berkshires. And so to just set the stage for the postcards, this is Susan at age 6. She stands in front of the restored fireplace of the birthplace. And it is really it's in the kitchen, of course, the fireplace, which is the signature of Quaker life. And if you're wondering how it is in the world that Susan B. Anthony at age 6 in 1826, we could have a photograph of her, you're right to wonder. This was actually digitally produced by Synthespian Studios, which is located in Williamstown, north of Adams in Massachusetts. Some of you, I'm sure, know Williamstown, Williams College. And they created this digital image of what Susan would have looked like at age 6. They used some of her later pictures and regressed them. Synthespian Studios has created The Amazing Adventures of Spider-Man and the Polar Express. So we were just delighted that they presented us with this picture on the opening day of the Birthplace Museum. And this, of course, is the museum today. This is the restored home. It's located, as I mentioned, in the very picturesque town of Adams, Massachusetts. And the Quakers used the house as a modest museum before it was restored. Many years earlier, they used it, and then it had been privately owned before it was acquired in 2006 and restored at that time. So here we are looking at, we're starting the postcard collection now, and this is the Anthony homestead when it was built by Susan's father in 1817. There's a number of iterations of this postcard. Again, this is the postcard beginning of this presentation. This particular card was from 1902. We know that because that's the postmark on the back of the card. But there were a number of iterations of the original picture of where Susan was born. And of course, this was extremely helpful to us in restoring the home. The door that you see there on the side had to be replaced because it had been boarded up. That was the entrance to Daniel's store. And that's the way, so that was so helpful to us in restoring the home. So it was very, very exciting to have these postcards. In 1902, of course, Susan hadn't died yet. She died in 1906. So she, of course, was well known. She was iconic in this area. And so her home was a feature made into a postcard, even that early on. Susan's mother, Lucy Reed, gave birth to Susan on February 15th in 1820. She was the second of 7 children. And close by on the Tophet Brook, Daniel built and owned and managed the first whole cloth textile mill in the Berkshires. The Quaker Meeting House, again, this postcard is just very, very exciting. It's where Susan and her family worshiped, and it still stands in near pristine condition near the birthplace. It's about 1.2 miles from the birthplace, and I can just imagine Susan going by buggy with her parents to worship in this wonderful, wonderful building. And you can, there are tours in the Quaker Meeting House in the summers. The Historic Society of Adams does give wonderful tours there. This photo of Susan is her earliest photo. And it's interesting that the Quakers frowned upon taking photographs of themselves. They believed that it was prideful, and that even in their own homes, they would not have had a tin to see themselves, or a mirror. And so Susan is pictured here. And this was in 1845. She was a school teacher. So it was only a few years after photography was invented. And it was made into a postcard. And one of the representations of this, of course, is what Synthespian Studios used in order to create the digital image, and regressed it to create Susan at age 6. Susan taught less than 8 years, but it was actually her teaching career. And you can see that she's kind of given up her Quaker grays and blacks, and she has a plaid dress here. And she taught for, as I said, only 8 years. But it was her teaching career that actually shaped her activism for the next 60 years of her life. Like Anthony, early suffrage leaders were fueled by the temperance movement. And as a teacher, Anthony witnessed, like other teachers did, the firsthand effects of liquor consumption on children. Children were abused by fathers. Children's mothers were abused by drunken husbands. And you can see that in this picture, it expresses the concern that teachers had for the boys in their class. Of course, it was boys in their class, not girls. My boys may go to ruin through the legalized saloon by your consent, but your boys never will be by my consent. And that was what they believed. This card poignantly illustrates a school teacher's concern. A family's scant resources were spent to purchase liquor oftentimes instead of children's shoes or books. And Anthony joined a New York State Temperance League. But much to her surprise and naivete, she found that women were not allowed to speak at these gatherings, of course, run by men. And so Susan, suffragists like Anthony, joined the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And besides concern for the welfare of the family, the Women's Christian Temperance Union wanted more money for education from taxes from the sale of the liquor industry. They wanted also to prevent children from dying from the swill milk epidemic. And this was, I learned so much through these postcards. It led me to explore other things that I would never have come to understand without this postcard. But the swill milk epidemic was the contamination of cow's milk from whiskey mash. And most of this was exposed in New York City around 1859. And women knew that if they had the vote, they would have done something about this earlier than 1895, when it was finally dealt with. They knew that in order to advance family health and moral character in the home, they needed the vote. They needed civic engagement. Even beasts of burden left outside of saloons were subject to the cruelties of the saloon industry. This is the only postcard that I have that indicates animals and the cruelty to animals. Susan B. Anthony did speak about this in The Revolution, her newspaper. But women saw temperance actually also as a method to temper or moderate male aggression in the marital bed. And so suffrage support for what they called voluntary motherhood and control over family size was directly tied, they believed, to liquor consumption. And it was not just liquor. Colorful characters, you all recognize this wonderful character, Carrie Nation. She condemned cigarette smoking and added that to the ruination of young males. Cards with Carrie are abundant. So many of these. I did not put all of these in the book. But Carrie actually produced and created postcards like this to fund her own activism. And so she was prolific with her own cards. The liquor industry took every opportunity to mock suffrage politics. And so the liquor industry ridiculed women, claiming that if women had the right to vote, they would simply devolve into the values and morals of men and smoke and drink too. And this is just such a colorful postcard. Just love it. This is a grouping of leather postcards. I bet you didn't know they had leather postcards. There's a section in the book of the leather postcards. The book is divided, by the way, into 11 different themes. And one of them is the leather postcards. It displays, this one in particular displays the suffrage flower, which is the sunflower. And that's because Kansas was the first state to give women the vote. It was a municipal suffrage. It was only municipal in the sense that you could vote for town board or the mayor of your city. And so the sunflower actually graces stationery, it graces china and linens of the period. The sunflower, ironically, is a very strong flower. It is resistant to pestilence. It's resistant to drought. And so it's strong. You cannot destroy the sunflower. So it's very appropriate that it is the suffrage image. Leather postcards were made from deer hide, and they became popular about 1902. But they had a short lifespan. In 1909, they were actually banned because the new postal machines could not cancel these cards. However, they were still sold for many, many years after. And the reason being because they were used by handcrafters to create dresser scarves and pillowcases. I have yet to find one of these, and I have tried. I learned so much about the leather postcards from the Smithsonian Institute Postal Museum. They did a story on the postcard collection, and I just was so excited about learning about the handcrafters. And you'll see around the edges of these postcards markings that allow the handcrafters to space their stitches and to create these beautiful handcrafted objects. And so besides voting rights for themselves, suffrage leaders participated in another major movement that was really going to change the world. And in 1852, the book was written that really shocked the nation, and you all know what that is. It's Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. It propelled suffragists into connecting the domestic sphere and social morality, and made the demand for the vote ever more convincing. So temperance, abolition, and suffrage proved to be an unstoppable triangulation, a mass movement of radical women who were bent on changing the world. A civic dialogue ensued about property rights and whether a human being could be owned by another human being. And outside of the polarizing North and South was, yes, again, Kansas. And the next picture, of course, is actually a new image. Oh, no, actually, we're going to talk. Yeah, I just had put this new image and I'm so excited. This is a new acquisition And it, of course, is Harriet Tubman. She was involved, certainly like John Brown and Harriet Beecher Stowe, in the abolition movement. She began her career early on in actually southern New Jersey. She began to operate the Underground Railroad using the tip of New Jersey and the Delaware River. There's a wonderful museum of which I'm part of in southern New Jersey, which I invite all of you to come and see the wonderful museum there. As a matter of fact, the executive director of the Harriet Tubman Museum in southern New Jersey will be speaking at Susan B. Anthony's birthplace celebration in February of 2023. So we invite all of you to come. But I'm so excited about this acquisition of this particular postcard. What we find here is that outside of the polarizing North and South was, yes, again, Kansas. Kansas, everything was happening in Kansas. It was the home state, of course, of Carrie Nation in her temperance movement. And it was also the state that first granted women the right to suffrage, municipal suffrage, as I mentioned. But it was also where John Brown organized his army. Susan's youngest sibling, Merritt, became a member of John Brown's army, if you can believe it. Now, during the Civil War, suffrage activism was put on hold, but Anthony really clung to her Quaker roots, and she refused to give enthusiastic support to the Civil War. And so it must have been very hard for her to accept the fact that her youngest sibling, Merritt, was a member of John Brown's army. He was not part of the Harper's Ferry event, but that must have been very hard for her to see that her brother was part of the violent revolution. These cards demonstrate how every movement, whether suffrage, temperance, or abolition, appropriated Lincoln to their cause. About suffrage, he says, it's very hard to see. It's the one on the right. He says, I believe in sharing in the privileges of government, by no means excluding women. This is certainly not a terribly enthusiastic rah-rah support for suffrage, but Susan and her colleagues clung to this. And she stated she was very, very excited to have the same person who was in favor of the emancipation of the slaves on the side, not only of temperance, because he was in favor of prohibition, but he was also in favor of suffrage. She believed that Lincoln was very, very weak in his support for suffrage, and actually in his support to eliminate slavery. And of course, he was weak, but it was something that he needed to be in order to pass the Emancipation Proclamation. When Susan B. Anthony's father died in 1862, Anthony chose Frederick Douglass to give the eulogy. This was clearly outside of the normal for any white upper class family to have a Black man eulogize a person's father. And so this kind of friendship was really unheard of prior to emancipation. This was in 1962, prior to emancipation, 1862, prior to emancipation. But she gave her enthusiastic support to Frederick Douglass up to a point. We know that Ida B. Wells was a friend of Susan, and she was an anti-lynching activist more in the late 19th century, early 20th century. She stayed with Anthony in her home, at least on one occasion that we know of. There was a story about Ida B. Wells that spoke about her needing some repair on a dress. Susan B. Anthony asked her seamstress to repair the dress. Her seamstress refused because Ida B. Wells was a Black woman. Susan B. Anthony fired her seamstress. So that was the story. But despite all of this, suffragists are accused of being racists. And let me explain a little bit why. This is one of the images in the book that's actually not a postcard, but I wanted to put it in there. It is the back and front flap of a very small pamphlet, the Philistine. And you can see here, it portrays a woman's bitterness and anger and hostility. That the split, it really created a split in the women's movement when the 15th Amendment was passed, because it gave Black men, not Black women, and not white women, the right to vote, but it did not give white women or Black women that right. And it caused a split in the suffrage movement. And so you can see this image of this anger here. So it was a rift that actually took 20 years to heal, because there were suffragists that created what was called the American Suffrage Association, and that was led by Lucy Stone, who I believe spoke in Winchester. She led the American Women's Suffrage Association. She believed that it was time for the Negroes to get the vote if white women just needed to wait. Susan B. Anthony led the other faction, and that was the National Women's Suffrage Association. And she believed in universal suffrage. She wanted it all or nothing. So despite this personal demonstration of racism that is accused, and rightly so, by some of the suffragists of today's scholars. This particular postcard is a handmade postcard, and it is a ridicule and mockery of a Black suffragist, as you can see here. So, the 15th Amendment that gave Negroes, men, the right to vote was actually passed in 1870, and that in 2020 was actually the 150th year. So the year 2020 was a huge year, 150th of the 15th Amendment, and as well as the 100th anniversary of suffrage, a huge year. So these images of the Black-faced handcrafted images really display the hostility of the women's movement. As I said, the American Women's Suffrage Association, led by Lucy Stone in Massachusetts, and the National Women's Suffrage Association, led by Susan B. Anthony, did not come back together until 1890, that split. This particular card is very interesting. I don't know how many of you know about phrenology. The last time I did give this talk, there were a couple people who understood about phrenology, but it's very funny. It's a study that measures the bumps and crevices of the head. It was a parlor game similar to signature analysis would have been in when I was young, 1960s. But it was taken far more seriously. Susan B. Anthony actually had her own head read in 1852 before she was a noteworthy figure, and it appeared to be futuristic in its accuracy. And I wanted to read it for you, but I don't know if I can't find that particular. Where is it? Oh, it must be in the front. Yeah, I'll find that. But so looking at this postcard, isn't this interesting? This is clearly a suffragist. As you can see, she has her Votes for Women banner newsletter on her lap. She's a testosterone heavy woman. And the banner on the wall, the man on the left was a criminal, and you can see his features are more primitive, they would say, than the man on the right, who was a prime minister when Balfour was a prime minister, right? I think he was, of Great Britain. So this is a Great British postcard from that collection. And so you can imagine how her head is going to be read. It really is sort of a eugenic representation that was popular during the time. I have put this postcard with the abolition section because of its eugenic nature. After the Civil War, Anthony published The Revolution, which was by far the most outspoken woman-run newspaper of its time. Its first editor was none other than Anthony's colleague and closest ally, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. The motto was men their rights and nothing more, women their rights and nothing less. The inaugural edition of that newspaper stated two policies, and they portrayed in numerous postcards. The first policy was that there were to be no standing armies. That's not surprised for a Quaker position. Suffragists supported less aggressive conflict, means to settle conflict. They wanted to bring men out of the bars, out of off the battlefield and into the home, and to be part of nurturing families. But for every postcard that proclaimed a good reason for women to vote, there was going to be its converse. And this card is an anti-suffrage mockery. So many of these cards are ridicule and mockery. If women got the right to vote, they would only take up male-dominated values and go to war too. And you can see she's even fighting war in her high heels there. The second policy of the revolution was that there would be no advertisements for quack or immoral medicines or abortion. This particular postcard, an ethereal image, portrays the death of a child and a grieving mother, and it is produced by the Chicago Probation League. Over 20 editorials in Susan B. Anthony's newspaper, many of them written by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, denounced the practice of abortion, and it was unanimously condemned, not only in their newspaper, but unanimously in other newspapers as well. They used straightforward language in these editorials. They called it child murder, feticide, evil of the age, a crime against humanity. The revolution actually ran lectures on embryology by Anna Dinsmore French, who was a very popular member of the Cirrhosis League. And she taught about quickening, and that the child was actually more developed than before you felt the child, but because they felt that education was so critical to understanding the evil of abortion. They also believed that if women had the right to vote, they would be able to expand their opportunities in the workplace, and that they would, that evils such as poverty, such as prostitution and abortion would be eliminated if they had the right to vote. Of particular interest surrounding the date of this card is Jane Addams. She's pictured here on the right, and as you know, she was the first woman to receive the Nobel Peace Prize for her work with immigrant populations. Her work coincided with the invention of the electric chair, which was actually in 1890. This picture of Jane Addams was in the early 20th century. Many suffragists, like Addams, considered the death penalty a violent practice, just like they did abortion, that it was a violent practice to solve a crime, and they were opposed to it. The illustrator of this next piece is Nina Allinger, and she was the designated cartoonist for the Suffragists, which was the newspaper of Alice Paul, who of course was the person who took Susan B. Anthony's place after Susan's death in 1906. The statement, child saving is women's work, resonates boldly in multiple representations throughout the postcards. It is connecting the domestic sphere and the civic sphere, proclaiming that women's vote would strengthen motherhood in families. Allender is had popularized the iconic donkey for Democrats and elephant for Republicans. Very, very fun. This particular image, you all know the artist here. He is the one who created Uncle Sam Needs You, and that is Montgomery flag. This particular image was created, a postcard was created from a magazine cover, which displayed this beautiful quote. And from 1912 was this particular quote. So this push-pull of children and families is the theme of nearly 1/3 of the postcards. Anti-suffragists, who, by the way, were the largest anti-suffrage organization was in Boston, they argued that children would suffer. The home would be abandoned if women got the vote. But suffragists countered that the domestic sphere would not be destroyed, but yet it would be enhanced by the vote. Women could really do both. And the reverse of this card is so fun. Senders of this card were encouraged to maximize the exposure of this message and send it on to another person. All you had to do was, I don't know if you can read that. It says, if you are in sympathy with this message, affix another stamp, cross off the first recipient, and repost it. Is that exciting? I mean, you know, we pride ourselves on recycling and repurposing, but is this very, very, very exciting? I just love it. Just love it. These are some of the more thoughtful and insightful expressions among the postcard collection. Anthony's National Women's Suffrage Association sold these cards, so they would have been sold before 1890. And I have about 18 of these in my collection. I understand that there are 22 in all. I'm still looking for the rest of these. But many of these cards make it clear that the center of both domestic life and civil life was, after all, none other than the mother. Postcards often employed non-threatening images of children and animals to promote the suffrage message. Cards like these were sold at fairs and church festivals and on street corners in New York City, in order to raise funds for suffrage travel, suffrage parades, and suffrage petitions. Don't you just love these cards? They are just so dear. These two sweet images, again, the innocuous representation of children, make a statement about the virtuousness of suffrage, doesn't it? These cards really symbolize motherly nurturing. And let me show you the back of this card. It was canceled. I guess that's the front of the card, you would say, but this card was canceled 4 times. It traveled from Reliance, Virginia on April 13th, 1906 at 4:30 p.m., showing 3 more cancellations on its way to Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, where it arrived on April the 18th. A deltiologist, I understand that's what I'm called because I collect postcards. I've never been called a lot of things, but that, according to the Smithsonian, I learned again so much. But it's not uncommon to have a lot of cancellations on your cards like this. canceled cards were considered far more valuable than cards that were just simply collected and stored into an album. And I certainly feel that way in my collection as well. Even holidays were, opportunities to sell items and raise money for the ever popular petition campaigns and suffrage parades. Valentines with the endearing Cupid are just proliferate in the suffrage representations. We actually made, copied and created note cards out of these wonderful Valentines and sell them in the Birthplace Museum for Valentine's Day. Well, anytime actually, but aren't they wonderful? It's just beautiful. And so were leap year cards. 2 years, 1908 and 1912, were smack in the middle of the high stakes rights for the suffrage vote. 2020 was also a leap year, and samples of the collection have been made also into postcards for the 2020 leap year. Children and animals were used in propaganda by those who oppose suffrage as well. And so, like social media today, no other medium lent itself to exaggeration and ridicule like the hasty post of a 1-cent stamp, the hasty tweet, you might say, right? And then the women would come back and put men in their place. Don't you just love it? Love this yin yang. But nothing was sacrosanct. Even Susan B. Anthony, of course, this is her image on a postcard. She portrays a woman as menacing and intimidating, but she was very popular on postcards as well. The anti-cards claimed that women who engage in politics were going to disrupt the family. Not only were children going to suffer, but fathers who were left to care for the children were going to suffer even more, right? But it gets worse. Male and female roles would be reversed. Do you just not love these images? These are hands down everyone's images in the book. The domestic sphere and the civic sphere were going to be topsy-turvy. These are the images from the Dunstan-Weiler series of lithographs. I have 7 of these, and I understand there are 12. So I'm still, again, on the lookout for more of these. More in the artist series. So in the book, there is a series called the artist series, and these images are from that particular grouping. This is the Walter Wellman cards, a very popular artist at the time. His cards are known by the soft greens and the light purples. I have 13 of these, and I understand there are 16. So Wellman predicted that there would be frilly senatoresses and overbearing judgettes if women got the vote. In horror of horrors, women would take up pastimes and do things like play golf. I remember getting this card in Montana, and the woman was so apologetic that it had writing all over the front of it, and that it cost, for heaven's sakes, $3. And of course, to me, it just made it more valuable. So it was well worth the $3. So very, very fun postcard. And while Susan B. Anthony pledged her own life insurance to advance education for women at the University of Rochester, other women feared disruption in the domestic sphere. They asserted that cheerleading was not useful knowledge. And many of the anti-suffragists were, of course, women. And women who wanted economic rights, the anti-suffragists declared already they had them. They just needed to go into the husband's pants. But a significant revolution was going on that was even greater than Anthony's newspaper, and that was the bicycle. Anthony claimed that the bicycle represented women's freedom more than any other single domestic item. Not only did this simple 2-wheeled contraption propel women toward independence. It was really a measure of her independence. And since a woman could not cycle in 11 pounds of petticoats, the bicycle brought in dress reform. Freedom of movement, right? It required different clothing. And so women no longer had to dress to please men. So next to getting the vote and condemning abortion and war, dress reform was actually the most discussed item, second to those issues in the revolution. And to go different places, she no longer needed a chaperone. She could go where she pleased. And again, this is one of the leather cards from the leather collection, and you see the markings around the edges for the handcrafters. The jocular exchange extended to other modes of transportation, and both sides, added to the frivolity of the debate. Women's suffrage was actually not a popular position among the Democrats as much as it was the party of Lincoln. But because even Woodrow Wilson, who finally approved the 19th Amendment, was very, very reluctant to do so. So there was a lot of discussion about the pants in the family, who was going to buy them, who was going to own them, and who was going to wear them. But postcard propaganda was not all innocent. These representations are in the section called violence, and many of these hostile images in my collection were printed in Germany right before World War I. They were likely produced and distributed. I don't know, have proof on this, but they were likely, in my opinion, distributed by the American Brewers Association. It was one of the stronger beer producers, of course, who wanted to silence women who favored prohibition. And it's no surprise that once the Prohibition Amendment passed, that was the 18th Amendment, when it passed early, it depends on when it was signed, but around 1919, that suffrage was passed immediately afterwards, because there was no reason to feel that the liquor industry had to silence women. But they ridiculed women who wanted the vote and claimed that they were really not the more nurturing gender. In the postcard section from other countries, the militancy of Great Britain, there's a number of countries that are displayed in this section. We have Ireland, we have Estonia, we have Mexico, Italy, France. But this particular one is in the section of Great Britain. And Great Britain, of course, passed suffrage in 1818, but it was not universal. You needed to own property. And so it was not universal suffrage even in 1818. But suffragists in Great Britain, of course, smashed windows, and the window smashing cards were used to both promote suffrage and anti-suffrage in the American movement. And it was actually, the museum has one of the toffee hammers, which is what they were used. They were symbols of the working women's entering the suffrage movement, women who worked in the candy stores. And we actually have one of these little toffee hammers in the museum. But it symbolizes more than the militancy of the movement, but the entree of the working women into the movement. Photography became an asset to the cause in the years immediately prior to the passage of suffrage. And this particular card is the March on Washington in 1913, I think. And so no longer were descriptions of rallies and parades left up to the biases of newspapers. You could see the peaceful demeanor, you could see the number of people who were at a parade. But again, humor proliferated. Here, men in drag purporting to be a women's baseball team, isn't this fun, claim that men use their lefts to fight for women's rights. It's just too fun, isn't it? But Anthony could never have imagined that her photo would travel all over the world. And truly, what do I want to say? Yeah, failure is impossible. I just love that that image. And I often wonder what Susan B. Anthony's mother would have thought, because of course they were, opposed to the image, but her image ended up being all over the world. So I will end right there. And I offer, I believe that Hilda mentioned that there could be questions and discussion at this point. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That was a really great story. Thank you very much, Carol, for sharing it. I have a question. Obviously, the book is available for purchase on Amazon. Do you display the collection in the house also?
Yes. There are about 60 of the postcards that are displayed in the house.
Okay.
That's right, there are. And yeah.
Because you said you have hundreds, right? Like, was it 400 or 600?
I have 650. I know.
Yeah,
I'm weird.
yeah, because I was like, no, but I'm just, I mean, it must be an amazing collection. I was wondering, do you ever display the entire thing?
There was the museum in Rochester, New York, where, of course, Susan B. Anthony has her activist home, and there's a museum for Susan B. Anthony in Rochester. The museum there did a nice display on the postcards for the suffrage celebration in 2020. But I have them in binders. So they're just very precious to me. One of the questions that often I am asked is, are these perhaps representations? And it's hard always to know whether you have an authentic piece. That's why purchasing these at flea markets, going through ephemera in antique stores is so important to actually see what you're buying. I identified probably 18 of the 400 images in the cards that are probably representations. And I identified those as representations in Vintage Tweets in the book. But the rest of them, they are authentic. And of course, you can tell because you can feel the stamp on the card. By the way, it was always 1 cent stamp, even until about 1925 was when the postcard stamp was raised to 2 cents. So it's really a lot of fun but a lot of the cards that I do have are authentically old, but were not mailed. And again, you can tell, generally speaking, if it is. I have had a curator look at the collection, of course. So it's important to me that they are indeed authentic and they're not representation. Buying them over the internet in email is, through online collections is not always a safe way to purchase them in order to get an authentic one.
Got it. Oh, great. Let me open it up to questions. What questions do folks have? You can either unmute yourself or you can type it into the chat.
I have a quick comment for you. I'm hoping that this will show up. Oh, it's not going to very well. Oh, shoot, that's too bad. This is a leather postcard that my grandfather gave to my grandmother. I have it on the shelf. It would take me just a few 2 minutes to find it in person, but the story behind it is, it says, greetings from Salt Lake City. There was a major resort on the Great Salt Lake in 1906. And my grandfather told me that there was a booth there that that you could go to and personalize a leather postcard for your sweetheart. And so on this postcard, it's a picture of sago lilies, which are representational of Utah territory. And you could go in and paint on the leather. And down in the corner, it says, "From Russ to Gwen, October 6th, 1906, which are my grandparents. On the other side, it says, it has the little word post up in the corner, but he apparently just handed it to her. But it's very, very sentimental for me to see something like this, and to know that that's how they courted each other, is by doing things like making these little postcards out of leather for the right time period.
Oh, that is just so fun. Oh my. Could you see if there were the markings around the edges? Were you able to?
Yeah, I'm sorry this isn't coming through so well. I just took a minute to try to look for the original. It's still on my shelf somehow. There are little ripple marks around the edges.
Yes, I see those.
And
yes.
So that might be what you've been talking about. Is it? This is the original is about 4x6. But it's leather, and I was very surprised to see it myself. As you were saying, most people don't know that there were leather postcards, and even though this one wasn't posted, apparently there's quite a few people that did do it that way to send to their sweethearts.
And don't you love the messages on the back? That's one of the questions that oftentimes people will ask is, what is the messages on the backs? And again, a lot of these cards, you have to remember, this was before the telephone was a household item. And so people would write messages like, thank you for the soup, mother's better. They would say things, I can't come to the meeting Tuesday night. So this would be, messages that would be the things that you would pick up the phone and call somebody. Lots of happy birthdays. Cards like, we got our corn in on Friday. Our tractor got stuck in the mud. It's just really fun. Not many of the cards actually relate to the pictures. I was surprised about that. And if the card's message said something about suffrage, I put that in the book. There was one that said in particular, is this like your wife? One card said. I know I did put those in. Very fun. Very fun. Well, that is priceless. Thank you for showing that.
Yes.
Any other questions?
Sure, I just had one quick question I'm just curious, how long have you been doing this? And where have your travels taken you that, where you hunt for these cards?
Oh my. Well, every time I go somewhere, I go to an antique store. My husband is very patient. But I've been collecting postcards probably for about 25 years. I actually started in Cape May, New Jersey, where the Harriet Tubman Museum is, and where I'm part of that museum. But I started collecting. We have a house there, and so I started collecting postcards of the old Victorian homes in Cape May, New Jersey. That was my very first postcards. But I have collected them, as I say, everywhere I go, and probably 10 or 12 different states that I've gone. As far as where I've spoken, to a university in South Carolina, to Florida, to oh my goodness, I can't, many places in New York, in Massachusetts, in Pennsylvania, a couple places. Alumni associations are particularly interested. Every burg, every historical society has their wonderful suffragists, and you, of course, Lucy Stone, being from Massachusetts, I believe that she has visited Winchester. So it's always fun to try to find something that is tangential to the speaking venue. and try to explore and talk about that a little bit. One of the places that I did speak, they were very big into cowhide, and so I did show a few more of the leather postcards, just because that may have been tangential to their own history. But these were deer hide, according to the Smithsonian. Most of these postcards were deer hide. But
does anybody on the call, are they aware of Lucy Stone? Does anyone know that answer? I don't. I don't know if Carol, Lori, anybody has any info on that. I don't see Ellen on tonight.
Lucy was the first woman to graduate from Oberlin College, and she had a daughter. She was known because she kept her name after she was married. That was just totally unreal. She married Harry Blackwell, and she kept her own name. After her daughter was born, she pulled back on the suffrage movement, and that was close to the time when the American Suffrage Association and the National combined. But she is a remarkable figure.
Mm-hmm. Any other question? Go ahead.
I was just going to ask you, do you have a particularly favorite or treasured postcard in your collection that you just, adore? It's just a rare find for you.
Yeah, I do love the Dunstan Weiler image of the Madonna and Child, the man who's holding the baby, and and he's got the plate in the background that represents the halo. Yep. I just think that is it. People love that particular card, Electra. They just and I have to say that that's one of the more favorite ones. Yeah, for sure.
Any other questions?
One question I often get, not to interrupt you, Joe, but one question I often get is, how much did you pay for their most expensive purchase? And it was $62, and they were much less expensive to purchase them prior to 2020. So I think 2020 really kicked up the price a lot, but that was my most expensive postcard. And I have to tell you, I don't remember which one it was. My cheapest one was the $3 one of the woman with the golf. So that was $3. So that was really a steal, I think.
I just Googled Lucy Stone and Winchester, and it did come up as saying that she spoke at the second meeting of the Women of Winchester group.
What year was that?
Well, it says it's April 10th, but it's a little slow in coming up. Excuse me.
Mm-hmm.
But it does give you that when you Google.
So she spoke there before the reconciliation of the two groups, which is very interesting. So there was still that split when she spoke there. Interesting.
Thank you. Any other questions?
We do have a racist statuette in the museum, and we have been criticized for displaying it. It is a statue of Sojourner Truth, a very miniature statue. It's one of the most expensive things in our collection. She's portrayed as a slut, and it's very degrading. We do make a point to try to talk about it so that it's not just for display, for gratuitous purposes only, so that you're educated about the racist nature of that. But we have had people come in and be very, very furious about that. But, it's worth talking about, whether these things should be displayed. Many people challenge us about the, other things. They don't like the revolution display that discusses their opposition to abortion. So there are, it's interesting. We keep ourselves open to hearing what people think about the suffrage positions, and we're always interested to entertain, and we learn with each other and try to grapple with those things. Yes.
History in its time. Yeah,
Right.
absolutely.
Hey,
Thank you.
this is Michelle.
Hi, Michelle.
Yay. Just a couple quick questions. In your collection, do you have a postcard or postcards from Newport and kind of the Votes for Women activities from that time?
Wow. Did we speak at Newport? I don't think we spoke. Michelle, that's a great question. I need to look at these postcards and see where they were all canceled. Yeah, I really didn't do that.
Okay, because I know Alva Vanderbilt had a lot of at her Newport mansion, had a lot of meetings for Votes for Women and designed a special tea set. So been interested in the Newport connection. Two more questions. Are there others that you know collecting these postcards, and have you met them?
Yes. The man that knows everything. Oh my goodness, his name, Richard. I've got his book here somewhere. Flory. Kenneth Flory. He has twice as many as I do, and he says that there are about 2,200 suffrage postcards that he knows about and that he has researched. He is the ultimate, and he also has produced a book. His book is a soft cover copy, and it's a lot more narrative than mine. My book is not big on the narrative. It's more book on the display of the pictures. He's much more of a historian than I am. So his book is wonderful.
Okay, is your book still available for purchase?
It sure is. Yes, it is.
Wonderful.
If you buy it on Amazon, it's more expensive. It is an expensive book. It's $75. But if you buy it through the Birthplace Museum, it's $49.95.
60, I believe.
$60. 60. It's not that much, is it?
It is.
Oh,
yeah.
I thought it was 49. Yeah, they're very popular around Mother's Day. They're fun for Mother's Day. Because it's very showy. It's extremely colorful. It was done by an artist designer who laid this out, and she's incredible. She's done a number of commemorative editions and anniversary editions for different museums and clubs, and it's beautifully done. I can't take credit for that part of it, but
Okay,
Great.
yes.
wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, Carol, thank you very much for sharing your story today. And we will, for those who have missed it, we are going to be, as you saw at the beginning, Electra did record today's session. So we will have it up and available on our website. We'll also have it available through WinCam as well.
All right.
Electra, I think we have a couple commercials for the next upcoming programs. We have another Peter Engeldrum film, which is our November event. And this is going to be both at the Jenks Center live in person, as well as live stream via WinCam. So this is, I think, Peter is thinking that it's a little bit over an hour. So we're starting it at 6:30, and that'll leave us a little bit of time for Q&A afterwards. But he is talking about the Great Wall of Winchester, which is actually quite appropriate. This was rescheduled from earlier this year, I think it was. And it is just sharing how Winchester came to have a raised railroad in the center of town. And then the second slide is, so we're gonna, hopefully, fingers crossed, we will have our annual members holiday party on December 4th. So it has been 3 years, I think, since, or has it been 4? Since 2019. So it's been 3 years since the last time we were able to be in person on one of these, our programs. So I'm looking forward to seeing everybody in person. Thank you very much for joining us today, and have a nice evening. Bye-bye.